The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Utah's public lands lawsuit. So what does this mean for the prospect of states having stronger management of land within their own borders?
The good news is that absolutely can happen, and the Supreme Court's decision doesn't limit any of that. That's still very feasible.
On this episode, we get an update on the status of the public lands dispute between the state of Utah and the federal government, and outline prospects for making progress through other legal means, the presidency, or through Congress. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and we're talking once again about public lands and federalism and the role of states versus the federal government when it comes to the management of lands within borders of big western states like Utah. Joining us once again for this conversation is Bill Duncan, our constitutional law and religious freedom fellow here at Sutherland. Bill, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Well, Bill, I wanted to talk to you about this because there have been some developments on the national level. We talked in a previous episode, which we'll, of course, link to in the show notes, about Utah's lawsuit about sort of federal land management. One, just kind of give us the breaking news update that happened recently.
Right. So just earlier this week, it would have been the 13th of January, the U.S. Supreme Court issued an order, and for those who know about these kinds of things, what happens essentially is that the court issues a couple of pages, and they say, we've been asked to handle the following cases, and we either accept those cases, and we'll have a full hearing and make a decision about them, or we say denied. We're not going to listen. We're not going to take that case on. And unfortunately, from the state of Utah's perspective, the state of Utah versus United States was denied. They decided not to take that. It's kind of interesting to try and understand that. One thing that we talked a little bit about last time, but maybe could be even clearer this time, is that the Utah was asking for something pretty unique. Typically, what would happen in a lawsuit involving that goes to the Supreme Court is there's been a trial, or at least a possibility of a trial at the lower level. Then it goes to the Court of Appeals, or to a state Supreme Court, then to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the state of Utah had asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take this directly, and to hold or to schedule a trial, and all of the kinds of things you would think of as being the first stop. So as we're trying to understand what happened, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, has said, no, we're not going to take this case as an initial matter. So we can talk a little more about what that might mean for the future, but the key thing is it doesn't really change anything substantively, but it does mean that this lawsuit will have to either sort of restart, or that the state may decide to go different routes to address the underlying concerns that they brought the lawsuit to, both to highlight and hopefully to address. The Supreme Court's going to will make that process a little bit longer, but maybe over the long term it'll turn out to be better, right, because we'll come up with even better solutions.
I want to pinpoint one thing just for clarity. So the U.S. Supreme Court essentially saying no to this request from the state of Utah. It's not on grounds of substance. It's not like
Correct.
The court is saying,
Correct.
well, your underlying argument of federalism and who gets to manage land, they didn't weigh in on any of that.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. The only word that's sort of significant is the word denied, and there's not even a sentence that describe that. So that's right. Now, of course, maybe some justices thought there was no merit in it, but I think that the justices probably recognized there are some serious issues here, but maybe you're hoping that perhaps the new administration, the Congress, or some lower courts might give some guidance first that might resolve some of the important issues that the state raised.
So we don't actually know why they denied. We can't divine the intent or something.
We'll have to wait till the justices' papers are released in 50 years or so.
Sure. So I guess with that, the question now obviously becomes what's next. But before we kind of get into that, I wonder if you can give us a refresher of the issue. And again, as you articulated, Utah as a state was doing something or trying to do something that was kind of unique, legally speaking. I guess what about this issue was so important to state leaders, and maybe in your view that warranted a unique approach? Why is this actually an important, unique question of constitutional law that would merit that kind of approach in the first place?
Absolutely. That's a great thing to ask about, because the interesting way that the court has approached, that the state of Utah has approached this is obviously to go to the court, but they also made a big effort, and I think we really highlighted this in our last podcast, to try and provide some public education materials to understand what's at stake in this case. So the specific claim is that the federal government is holding on to large swaths of land, mostly in the western states. So if you think about it just as an example, in states in the Northeast, maybe 1% to 3% of the land within those states is owned by the federal government. Now, why does the federal government own land? Well, for some really good reasons. Military bases, national parks, things that I think everybody recognizes. Oh yeah, those are reasonable uses. Those are the kinds of things the Constitution has in mind when it gives Congress the power to regulate the use of land that the federal government owns in the states. The Constitution then goes on to say that other public lands, it gives Congress the power to dispose of those lands. And dispose of usually means get rid of, right? And through our history, in the states that were created, like with the Ohio Territory and things, so early in the history of the United States, the government would get those lands through treaty or some other reason, and then they would dispose of them by selling them to developers, giving them to the states, or doing other things to allow those to have a productive use by the people that were there. That changed dramatically when Utah and other states were becoming, most of the western states became states, and the federal government held on to, and as late as 1976 said, our policy is to just hold on to these lands indefinitely. So what happens in practice is the Bureau of Land Management is given the ability to manage these lands, and they do that maybe through leasing to private parties to use the mineral rights or things, or to film movies on, whatever, and then that money goes to the federal government. Now, the concern maybe will seem obvious to many people is, well, wait a second, if this, in the case of Utah, 60% of the land mass of the state of Utah is owned by the federal government. Now, some of that is used again for appropriate, federal purposes that make sense. But much of it is unappropriated. The state's not able to control it, but the federal government's not really using it either, not for any federal purpose. And so that's that section, maybe 30% of the public land of the land in Utah is held indefinitely by the federal government, and that's the part that Utah was trying to ask the Supreme Court to address. Why is that an important issue? Well, it's important, obviously, because the people who live close to that land, who benefit from it, who could be affected by decisions made about how it's controlled, clearly would like more say in how it's being used and managed through their representatives who are close to them, state and local officials. But it's also important because the principle of federalism is implicated by this. And what I love about the idea of the principle of federalism in England before we sort of became the United States, the thought was you can only have one sovereign. There can only be one sort of final sort of power, and of course that might have been the king. In the United States, we shifted when we created a national constitution. It began with "We the people," and we the people. So the people become the kind of the ultimate source of authority. And even though it would seem strange to many people to say, well, there could be different sources of authority, in the United States we say, well, yeah, the people are the final ultimate source. But, and I take this phrase from John McGinnis, a great law professor. He says, well, but Americans split the atom. And they said, okay, well, of sovereignty specifically, we're going to keep sovereignty to ourselves as the people, and we're going to designate a constitution that gives some power to the federal government, the things that they can only do best, handling interactions with foreign countries, the military, and all of that. And then we also are going to assign to the states some important authority, the things that affect the day-to-day life of citizens. And that division is critical to preserving the principle of representation, that people being able to vote for those who make decisions that affect them, but also for separating powers in different locations so that there's always a check on one branch, or I'm sorry, not one branch, but one level of government sort of taking on too much. Does the federal government do too much? The states can push back. If the states abuse their power, and we certainly saw that when the lead up to the Civil War, the federal government, there's some parts of the Constitution that give the federal government the authority to come in and fix those things. So this is really a great system, and it's intended to work really well. But when vast parts of authority that were intended to be given to the state government are actually taken by the federal government without any specific designation from the people, that's where we run into trouble. And that's kind of what's the underlying concern with what's going on here.
Is that why there was this idea of sort of jumping, I don't know, to the front of the line, probably isn't the right term, but going right to the U.S. Supreme Court rather than having to go through district courts because of those things you said, because it touches on these core constitutional questions?
Yeah, you hit that exactly right, because the two sovereigns and the U.S. Constitution in Article 3, which is the part of the Constitution that gives the authority of the Supreme Court to hear cases, tries to deal with this. What if you have two kinds of two of these designated sources of authority, they need to work out a disagreement between them. They can do that. And so typically when the U.S. Supreme Court takes a case originally like this, it's between states, but it can be between the federal government and the states, or the states and federal government. And that's so in a way it was kind of honoring that reality by trying to bring it that way. But there's lots of different ways to address the question of federalism, trying to make the balance look a lot more like the written Constitution intends.
So with this now being the decision, again, I was going to say to oversimplify, but it's kind of not, because all the Supreme Court said was no to this. With that being the answer for that particular attempt, what's next? What does this mean for the effort that the state of Utah is engaging in, and that other states, especially Western states, are interested in, as far as, again, shifting that federalism back in the direction of states to manage the land within their borders? What's next for this?
Right. Earlier I said that the written Constitution doesn't intend. A better way of saying that is the written Constitution has created a careful division of authority, and it doesn't really matter the intention. The language is clear there. So there's lots of ways to get at restoring the constitutional balance of authority that we call federalism. Clearly, the one relatively simple way is for the executive branch to stop asking to do so much. Be more careful about what regulations they issue, how much they take on in authority, how much they ask to do. The Constitution, though, it's always good to remember that Article 1 of the Constitution deals with the legislative branch of government. And there, ultimately, I think most of what should be done by Congress. Congress should step forward and say, it's not reasonable for the federal government to continue to manage so much land in the western states. That ought to be managed by the people of those states through their elected representatives. And they can do that. They can make changes to existing law. They can create new laws that clarify exactly what executive branch agencies can and can't do in terms of managing land, or they can require that the federal government dispose of that land, meaning allow states to use it as state public land, or in some appropriate cases to be used for other purposes. So Congress could step forward. The states are in a tougher position, and that's why the Utah went to the U.S. Supreme Court, because they don't have a direct, if the federal government is not willing to stay within the bounds that's set for it by the U.S. Constitution, Utah can ask for the federal courts or the other branches of government to do the right thing, but to some degree they're kind of suppliants. They're saying, please help us. And if that doesn't happen, the states are somewhat limited. But they're not entirely limited. They can continue to bring the issue up. Hopefully, I think we all recognize that there's perhaps a greater interest in federalism right now than maybe there has been before. Probably kind of a bipartisan interests because some people don't like what the last president does, some people don't like what the next president will do, and we recognize that there's real value in allowing the states to have a little diversity in the way they approach issues. But given all of that, states can continue to try and convince their own citizens and their federal representatives to rein in that the federal overreach, which has been so consistent a part of our culture for so long. But the good news is that absolutely can happen, and the Supreme Court's decision doesn't limit any of that. That's still very feasible.
So it sounds like, to try and boil this down, you mentioned two things: the executive branch, so the presidency, could stop, using this power. Would a way to articulate that be the president should just not use the Antiquities Act? Essentially, don't create new monuments under the Antiquities Act. Is that
correct? Correct. That would be one example. Or direct the agencies or direct the Bureau of Land Management to allow to deed some of that authority back to the states to manage that land. It doesn't all have to be just held by the federal government. A lot of states have state trust lands that they use and they keep undeveloped so that people can enjoy it and all the things that we know that are important to do with the land. But they also can do what the Bureau of Land Management is currently doing, and that is to lease it for appropriate uses that are not destructive of the land, but which then can support educational systems, appropriate, if some of that land is used by people who pay taxes, and increase the range of things that the states can do with that money, directly benefiting those who live close to that land.
So could the president then just give all the land back to a state, or does it need an act of Congress in some way?
It's a little of both. So Congress really needs to act, and that's always the case. Congress is intended to be the one to act and make major policies. Currently, the law says that the agencies can and should hold on to this land. That really probably does need to change, and the president then would be free to do more in effectuating what Congress would in that case be asking them to do. But there's so many ways, even short of that, where the federal government doesn't always listen to the states and isn't always responsive to state concerns. Nationally, we're all paying a lot of attention to the really terrible tragedy that people in California are experiencing with wildfires. Now, this is not a federal issue in one sense, because what's happening in California, part of it, of course, is just a natural disaster. But a lot of the concerns that are raised about how the response to the fire is really local. But having said that, this issue comes up constantly in this debate over public lands, because there's different incentives for federal agencies to keep to prevent fires. They don't have the same incentive that someone who's really close to that land, someone whose home could be affected by a wildfire that's currently on land owned by the federal government or managed by the federal government, but that could clearly, in a case like what we saw in California, spread to homes and the businesses and things. So these are existential issues for many people, and I think that's why we need to figure out better ways to approach this. The opportunity for the Supreme Court to weigh in would have been valuable, but and maybe they will in the future. The state can certainly file a lawsuit in district court and go that route. But whatever the route for getting at solutions, I think that perhaps we're at one of our most auspicious moments to begin to address this issue in an appropriate way.
So talk to us in terms of timing. I mean, it sounds like right now, of course, we have a new presidential administration coming in. We have a new Congress coming in. So right now, the Congress could this year pass a law, to what you're saying, directing federal agencies to dispose land back to the states. The president can say, I agree with this. Here's what I'm going to do through my office. Am I correct in assuming that if that were to all align, that would be a quicker path than what the state of Utah could now do, as you said, file in district court and go that way? Can you talk to us about here are the possible trajectories? what's the process and timing look like for each of those, just so we can kind of know what to expect in the coming years?
Yeah, great question. The quickest route would be for Congress to act, to recognize we've got the way we've been doing things for a very long time has created lots of challenges, some serious problems for the states, and we want to help resolve that. And so if they act, that would be the quickest way to do it. Not only would it be the quickest way, but it's the way that comports best with the constitutional design. The legislature is supposed to legislate to address serious concerns that affect the United States. A president can do things like limiting the amount of land that they designate as public lands and take out of the management of the people of the states. So that also could go relatively quickly. But again, there's limits on that, and it's intentional. The president's not supposed to be sort of a superpower that sort of can sort of control everything that happens. The Congress needs to act when that's according to its role. The slowest route will be to go through the courts, and in Utah is free to do that. They could bring a lawsuit and say the way that the federal land's being managed is inconsistent with the Constitution, and we would like a district court, presumably a District of Utah, to rule on that, and that would go to the Court of Appeals. But we're talking multiple years for that to happen. Politically, we don't know that any of this will happen quickly, and so Utah, I'm sure that its officials are thinking about the right way to do that, and maybe a mix of things that would happen. I think personally that a mix of federal efforts, probably spurred on by a very consistent voice from a wide range of states, both blue and red states, as they say, who recognize that the system of federalism benefits all Americans. That consistent drumbeat of allow us to make policies that within our constitutional authority could make a big difference. And not only on this specific issue, but generally on getting us a little closer to where the constitutional design intended us to be.
And that's kind of a good way to take what you just said and maybe make it a little bit more pointed for Utah leadership. If Utah's governor, legislative leadership, just the Utah sort of leadership cohort that has been pursuing this issue, if they were to come to you and say, Bill, what should we do? And if other Western states said, Bill, what should we do? Just give us the roadmap. What would be your preferred? Here's exactly what you can do this year and the coming years. Give us kind of the game plan.
Well, I think they could do. All of those states could work together. And again, I really want to stress that it would be a bipartisan thing. The state of Colorado is a Western state. It has a different government and different maybe political philosophy, but they would benefit as much from federalism as a state like Idaho or Utah would. Those kinds of states need to, I think, work together and recognize, we'll come up with some differences about what the actual outcome will be on specific issues, but we all recognize, and of course, I know I'm thinking of the Western states because Utah is there, but the Eastern states benefit as well. Many of the states need to sort of begin to work together and to call with a united voice on Congress to address many of the ways in which the federal government has taken on authority beyond what the Constitution allows for, and to plead, and maybe even cajole the federal government to let states manage things that the Constitution wants states to manage. The federal government certainly has a very important role. We fought a civil war to ensure that the federal government could take care of protecting civil rights of all citizens when states overstep their own authority. But in the vast majority of issues that kind of day-to-day affect us as citizens, those things go right to the states, and the states, to this degree, the states kind of either just meekly allow the federal government to act without their protest, then the situation's not likely to get better. But if the states kind of, again, in a united voice, begin to gather together and say, we really need to change this balance back to what it was intended to be, I think actual change would happen. I think Congress would hear that and act. And I think voters, as they understand that what's at stake, would, for the most part, recognize there's real value in the system the framers initially created.
Let's close with that point on voters, because I think a lot of this issue, of course, understandably and naturally focuses on the constitutional question, the legal structure, the legal processes, but bring it back to the regular voter, the regular citizen of Utah, and maybe you've mentioned before, but reiterate some of the messages of why would it just be a good thing for states and the state of Utah to have greater ability to manage these lands and manage all the areas within kind of the realm of public lands that traditionally have been held by the federal government. Just from a policy outcome, sort of quality of life, why would that be a good thing for the people of Utah and the people of the West?
That's a great bottom line to get at as we talk. The people don't always make the right decisions, but people who are interacting with each other, their fellow citizens, their neighbors, and with the people that they directly choose to represent them. So that doesn't just mean elections, but in a state like Utah, I can go to a store and see one of the federal representatives shopping just like the rest of us, and interact with that person. I try to leave them alone while they're shopping, but we can interact with these people, and we have the same scenario or situations in which we live. We as Americans recognize what's going to be best for our communities. For the most part, we may make mistakes here and there, but the design of the Constitution was to allow those decisions that have a direct impact on our lives, especially things like what's the fire risk in my area, what kinds of recreational opportunities are available close to where we live, how can we ensure that the environment I live in is beautiful and pristine. All of those kinds of questions directly affect us, should be made by the people we can get to most quickly to influence and to tell them this is what we really think needs to happen. When those decisions are held not only by distant officials but by unelected officials, all of the benefits that federalism was intended to provide for us are completely lost. Not to say that federal officials are bad people, but just the feedback mechanism that the Constitution established is the benefits that was intended to give us are lost completely. And so maybe sometimes they'll make good decisions, maybe they'll call local officials and ask for advice, but there's no guarantee of that. And when we lose that sense of accountability, of self-government, of managing our day-to-day government through our own elected officials that are close to us whom we can influence, we actually lose something much more significant, even than just the use of public lands. We lose our ability to be truly self-governing. But we also lose a lot of the benefits that the lands around us are intended to, that really I'd say providentially we have. And so I think this is a great symbol of a broader concern, and a good way to remind us. Let's go back to things that are really the amazing foresight of the framers of the Constitution had in ensuring that self-government would allow us to preserve the quality of life that we kind of sum up as the pursuit of happiness.
Well, Bill, we will leave it there. Amazing update and context as far as kind of what's next on this issue. We'll, of course, continue to watch it closely and probably have some follow-up conversations. But thanks again for sharing your time and expertise, and keep us posted as this issue progresses. It's not going away anytime soon, so we're just grateful for your time with us here on Defending Ideas.
Thanks so much.
We're going to take a quick break before we leave you with some final thoughts. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. In light of the news that the Supreme Court decided not to take up Utah's case, there are a few important takeaways for you and I to remember. Number one, this was not a defeat based on substance. Really, it was the court saying no to this particular process or mechanism of getting the issue before the justices. The state of Utah can still file in district court, where the lawsuit could still end up before the Supreme Court in the coming years. Number 2, there are other significant policy mechanisms to make a difference on this issue, as Bill outlined through Congress and the presidency. And number 3, it's important for you and I to remember the core principle at stake on this issue is federalism, the ability of elected officials closer to the people to make decisions about things that affect those people. In this case, the management of huge swaths of land within our own state. That is it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.